You are an unruly crowd in a lecture theatre. There's always a natural silence that follows. Well, welcome everybody. I'm very aware that we are the session standing between you and your lunch, so I'm going to get us underway and do our best to get us finished on time. Thank you. It's wonderful to be here, and thank you for joining us. So today, this panel is called What Authors Want. I think what we're trying to say is what authors really want. I realise there are some other questions in there. What do authors say they want? Do authors know what they want? From listening to the conversations over the last day, I'm pretty sure you guys do have a good idea of what authors want, but obviously it's a complex and kind of messy picture. So I'm going to begin with the introductions, and then for the format of the panel, I'm going to say a little bit and then invite each of our three speakers to give their reflections on what authors want. And then we'll maybe go back and forth between ourselves a bit and then open the floor, as in the other sessions, so you can quiz us, because you've got real life specimens in the room. And of course, should just say, I realise that there is an overlap, and there may well be people in the audience who are also authors and also publishing with the presses. So I don't imagine there to be a huge divide here. So in terms of how we approach this, it's a really hard question to answer, and again, this is going to state the obvious, but there are many authors, and many authors want different things. So we know, for example, that different disciplines have very different approaches to reading and engaging with academic texts and materials, and in terms of thinking about their publishing. There is the, if you like, the slow scholar, who maybe takes 15 years working on a monograph, and then there are the disciplines who are all about the preprint, and by the time it's published, it's dead to them, right? So there's wide diversity there. And then there's also major issues for people at different career stages. And we wanted to reflect that in the composition of the panel so that we can't cover everything, but we can get 3 different snapshots of how things might work. So to introduce people and to kind of give you a sense of how that's going to work. So I'll begin with myself. So, sorry, I'm just going to have getting very dry mouth. So my name is Alex Thomson. I'm head of the School of Literatures, Languages and Cultures here at the University of Edinburgh. I won't introduce the school. I have lots of facts and figures at my fingertips. If anyone wants to ask me what we're really great at, how many staff we have, what our budget is, really happy to go into that later. More importantly today is the fact that for a long time I was convener of the Academic Press Committee of Edinburgh University Press. I once said, in fact, when I was offered the role, I said that that was the only job in the university that I'd ever actually wanted. So maybe that suggests I'm slightly more reluctant to be a head of school, but definitely I got a lot more out of being an academic convener, because I really enjoy working with different disciplines, really enjoy working with the publishing side of a press, as well as thinking about the author and the editorial perspective. So it really allowed me to play, basically, and support, I'm going to say it, Edinburgh University Press through a period of kind of incredible transformation and growth and thriving. So it was a real thrill to be asked. The other hat that I wear is that I'm a member of the English Association, and I can't technically say that I'm the chair of their publishing committee, but I'm about to be. So that's a learner society with a publishing program as well. So that's the perspectives that I bring. So just to introduce our panelists. So next to me is Chris Perkins, who is senior lecturer in Japanese at the University of Edinburgh. So he works in my school and has to keep an eye on what he says. His specialisms are in modern history, politics, and the media, and for the panel basis, he brings a kind of more social science-oriented approach grounded in language-based area studies with expertise in international relations in social and political theory. It's traditional for an academic panel for us to plug their most recent book, so that's also to celebrate the work of publishers in the room. He's just published the Tokyo University Trial and the Struggle Against Order in Post-War Japan 2024, so we'll try and keep him off that topic. Next to Chris is Zoe Hope Bulaitis, who is a lecturer, and I just think this is a fantastic job title and programme. She's a lecturer in liberal arts and natural sciences. And again, I think that's a real sign of the future and how British universities are changing, that role should exist. And that's at the University of Birmingham. Now, her research centres on the articulation of cultural value in contemporary higher education and the creative sector. And her recent monograph, Value in the Humanities, the Neoliberal University and Our Victorian Inheritance, is available open access, so you've got no excuse not to read that. And starting this year, she's the co-founder of the international open access journal Public Humanities, launching with Cambridge University Press. So there's a nice synchronicity with Mandy's presentation. And finally, on the far end of the panel is Aileen Fyfe, who is Professor of Modern History at the University of St Andrews and may well be known to many of you in the room because she's undertaken really extensive and influential and wide-reaching research on academic publishing itself from the 17th century to the present. The most, I think, well-known output is her open access monograph co-authored, A History of Scientific Journals, publishing at the Royal Society 1665 to 2015. And then what I found very useful in helping other colleagues understand what's going on in learned societies and publishing, even members of learned societies, is a summary briefing paper called Untangling Academic Publishing, a history of the relationships between commercial interests, academic prestige, and the circulation of research. Now, those are three topics which I think are going to intersect in everything that our speakers are going to say today. So having introduced you in one order, I'm going to invite you to speak in another, and then we'll respond to each other. I have some questions should discussion flag, and then we'll open the floor. But Aileen, I wonder if you'd be happy to kick us off.
Okay, fair enough. It's lovely to see some old friends from some of these meetings before, and interesting though for me to be speaking as an author rather than as the historian of academic publishing. One of the things that Alex asked us to do was talk a little bit about our experiences as authors, how that's changed over our careers, what we want from our publishers. So I'm going to say a little bit about my publishing career so that I can then get to the thoughts. So I'm the author of 3 authored monographs and the editor of 2 edited volumes, all of them with university presses. That's 3 different university presses on both sides of the Atlantic. So I'm pretty much immersed in university press publishing, and I'll point out that some of my academic work is also on learned societies, so the importance of mission-driven publishing is significant to all of this. The most recent book, the scientific journals one, is open access. The others were more traditionally published. And I hope at some point we can talk about things like sales figures versus circulation numbers, and I looked up my royalty statements in preparation. But thinking about when I first was in the business of choosing a publisher, I was just finishing my PhD. What did I want from a publisher? I wanted to be published. As a historian of science, then I've written a thesis. What's the next stage? You do the book of thesis, or the book that's kind of loosely based on the thesis, but is hopefully better than the thesis. As a junior person who knows very little at this point, I knew a lot about Victorian publishing, I should say, but my grasp of late 20th century publishing was perhaps somewhat different. I'm always about 150 years out of date on this, it feels. But how do I go about choosing a publisher? Well, I ask the people in my discipline. There was, and still is, one particular university press that stands out in that discipline. It's got the biggest exhibit table in the big conferences. Many of my colleagues and people I cite publish with that publisher. So when I find myself at a conference and somebody says, oh, you should go and talk to that editor over there, I'll introduce you. The rest is history, essentially. That's why I went with my first publisher. There wasn't anything about, did I know much about how fast they were. Some of the bullet points Alex put on here about, there was discoverability, there was customer service, I knew nothing about any of that. What I did know was reputation and recommendation from other people. And that's why I was with that publisher for the first 2 authored books and the first co-edited volume. And I suppose if I'd had a bad experience, I could have left. The fact that I didn't is, I'm there, I've got home, it works. It's not, I don't feel that I wasn't shopping around for a publisher. But I will say it's different for this the scientific journals book was a very different experience because at that point I was shopping around for a publisher. And that's partly being at a different career stage. I now feel able to think a little bit more. I'm not quite so desperate. I have to get published, please somebody give me an advance contract desperately. I can perhaps sit back a little bit. But also because it was very clear that the History of Scientific Journals project was going to be a big book. We knew that early on. The mission of that book was to cover 350 years worth of historical archival study. When we started talking to publishers about it, which in my world this means you go to academic conferences and you talk to the acquisitions editors who are also at the same conferences. So if you've ever wondered if that's worth your while, then I would say yes. But the fact that we wanted to write this 350-year book, and it was going to be more than 100,000 words, I'm afraid. It was going to be more than 110,000 words. Difficult to find an editor who was excited about that prospect. So that was a bit difficult. So one of the things, therefore, that at that point I very much wanted from a publisher was someone who would take the length. And not, I'm afraid, as a 3-volume institutional history, which is was one of the suggestions put forward, because this is back in 2014, 2015, when we're having those discussions. And the idea that we might want open access didn't even start to get discussed among me and my project team until about 2016, 17. And then it was really rare, and it wasn't a plausible option at that point. We didn't want the 3-volume institutional history because we wanted people to read our book. We felt that as a book about scientific journals, it had to be read beyond just historians. It had to do more than just be the 200 copies sitting in an institutional library somewhere around the world that hopefully somebody occasionally looks at. We wanted some of the scientists to read it. We wanted publishers and policymakers to at least read some of it. So a 3-volume institutional history wasn't going to be that. So the eventual choice of publisher for that is as much determined on length, which we wanted, but in a format which would be accessible. And by the time we finally came to agree the publisher for that book, open access had become much more important in the UK publishing landscape, but also to us as a team of people who cared about the history of publishing and the future of publishing. So there was different things then about what one wanted from a publisher. And I think I have some things I could reflect on about the difference publishing open access versus publishing traditional, but I think maybe we should let some other people talk first and we can come back to that. So, Zoe? Yes. Do you want to tell us about your story?
I will. I'm glad you've taken the approach of talking about your experience, because I also have. I thought it might be interesting to start off with just 3 biographical notes about 1, my career stage, 2, my area of specialism, and then thirdly, my values in publishing, just to give you a sense of kind of what has led me to the decisions I've made in my career so far. I think, Alex, that I represent the early career perspective here. I'm not speaking for anyone else. Although now when I count back to my PhD, I feel like I might be leaving that era ready or not now. But I think a major publishing decision-making process to date has been about the transparency of timelines in terms of publishing a monograph. Perhaps being in the position where my first book was about the contemporary university, I was really intentional about approaching publishers and publications that could deliver a manuscript, or at least a response to a proposal on a manuscript in a timely fashion. I spoke to colleagues, I spoke to friends, and heard some stories around the length in which one might expect to hear a reply from a press, and I avoided those. I really sought timeliness and communication as a priority in publishing my first monograph. I think that speaks to, 1, my desire to just get research out there. That's one of my main aspirations in life, is just to share knowledge. But I think also it speaks to the competitive nature of the academic job market. And if you are looking for a permanent post in the UK, having a book that you can say, here it is, it matters. So that was really important for me in the first project. In terms of my background and specialism, I'm a literary scholar by training. As Alex said, I work more broadly across the articulation of the value of the humanities as a set of practices. And I think that area of expertise that I have means that I maybe care a bit more about publishing as a sector, but also as a practice, as a form of public value making than other sectors perhaps. But I really don't think I'm alone in that positioning. I think that there are people who work in the field of public humanities, people who work in digital culture, digital humanities, media, communications, policy-facing scholarly roles, who all share this kind of feeling that the publishers are partners, they're a parallel sector, they are sometimes the subject matter of their work. And I think that matters increasingly as we see that kind of disciplinary flourishing of these kind of forms of research in terms of the relationships to publishers. I think these kinds of authors want to know how their book is going to be marketed up front. They want to have conversations about how that policy paper that is also going to be associated with the book is actually going to sit alongside that or not on the press's website. These are kind of technical things that, as an academic, I am genuinely interested in. I also think that idea about kind of parallel sectors, thinking about the publishing industry as being a force for knowledge making, interested in commissioning works. I want to know about that too. I want to know about the kind of lists and collections that are being sought, as well as what I might have or think about. So that's the kind of collaborative, conversational mode. So that boils down, I think, to having good relationships with commissioning editors, but also opening conversations about the surrounding materials before things are submitted, before we get to that stage of it being nearly done, but actually in the planning process. And the last thing that I wanted to say in this kind of opening introduction around values would be going back to that point I made about the accessibility of research. For me, that is the fundamental reason that I pursue publishing as a practice, and I've actively sought for all of the publications that I've written in my career to date to be available open access. It has meant a huge amount of creativity and legwork on my part, especially around book projects. And I think that what I would want, or perhaps what authors thinking around this would seek from publishers perhaps, would be a collaborative feeling of support around that. Conversations historically have been, we want you to do open access research and publish that, that's amazing, we support you. It's a conversation for you to have and to work out with funders about how that can happen. And I think we are seeing shifts and changes around that, but certainly for the book project, it still sort of sits there as this thing. And equally, I'd love to have better channels for people who have trod those paths before to communicate, for networks to be kind of established through publishing houses around people who have done this kind of work and their experiences of that. But as a positive coder, I would say that my experience of open access journal publishing has been much easier and smoother. One, because of the amazing work of Diamond open access publishing activists, some of whom we'll hear about in the next panel. But beyond this best practice, I think there are growing examples of the success of agreements that go beyond kind of individual institutional costs, thinking about the idea of equity. I think these are gaining traction as we move away from the unsustainable model of APCs for individual authors. And to just end with an example, I'm, as Alex said, launching an international open access journal with Cambridge. Our first issue will come out in November this year, which is dedicated to the topic or theme of the public humanities. And being a journal that investigates, interrogates, articulates the public value of research, there was absolutely no way that we were going to have barriers to that in terms of authorship. So we are really happy with this combination of different open access schemes. It's a patchwork rather than a kind of one blanket system at the moment, but it means that we can guarantee no author will face barriers and financial barriers to publishing in our journal or indeed reading it. So I think that's something I'm really proud of, and I hope that we can kind of work towards that across all different media types. So thank you.
Great, thank you very much. So yeah, my career started in politics and international relations, and that's what I was trained in. It was quite interesting sort of growing up in that discipline because a lot of the focus of my publishing was on high impact journals, and the discipline really pushed me towards getting articles out, whether they're co-authored or single-authored, into the journals that were highly cited within the field. And this was the way that you demonstrated your productivity and ultimately you would secure a job. Interestingly for me, I applied for about 40 jobs in politics and international relations and one job in Japanese studies, and I got the one in Japanese studies. And that was a really huge transition because the culture around publishing in Japanese studies was very, very different. Especially in our school, where there was a bit more of a focus on producing monographs. And actually, that isn't something I'd really thought about too much. When I finished my PhD, I dismembered it, and I published it all over the place, and that's what one did. So that put me in a position to actually have to start thinking about what a monograph would look like, especially a new monograph, as I'd already used up my PhD material. So I had to churn out a book with my manager kind of hovering over me saying, "Chris, how's it getting on? How are you doing? Probation, how are you getting on?" kind of thing. So that isn't what it was like, but it was a little bit like that. So that I ended up publishing a book on the Japanese radical left in sort of I was like 2015 or something like that, and I had a very good experience with that publisher, and I went on to publish another book recently, again on the Japanese radical left in the 1960s and 1970s. I'm also co-editing a book on Japanese intellectual thought, which is quite an interesting experience in and of itself because editing collections is a whole other kettle of fish, isn't it? And some publishers are really into them, some really are not. And it's kind of working out the best venue for these things and how to pitch them. It's been quite an interesting experience for me. So just talking about some of my reflections on the process and what academics want from publishers. it was quite interesting the way in which the question was posed, because what academics want, and we've all said, yeah, but lots of different academics. I actually did try and characterize what an academic is, so just bear with me. So I think an academic, if I was to just give characteristics, would be a kind of a weird mix of this egotism that says, I need to say something about the world and you will listen to me. And then this kind of really strange imposter syndrome that says, but why would anybody take me seriously? I'm rubbish. Right, so there's that kind of tension sitting there. There's also this kind of tendency towards this perfectionism, which is born of millions of years of marking students' essays and being told that you're rubbish all the time and you need to be better. And I think that actually that can get inside your mind in lots of interesting and horrible ways and turn you into a mad person sometimes. And that's part of, being an academic, but also, I'm sure, as you all are aware, of dealing with academics. But I think there's also this kind of general abject terror, at least I feel this general abject terror, of the idea of the work that we've produced, we put all this energy and resources and time, passion, pain into our research, and it would go into the world and not be understood in the way in which we want it to be understood, right? And I think as publishers, I suppose like it or not, there is an element of you in the conduit for this, and it's something which is a very difficult thing to negotiate, I think, sometimes, because of some of the constraints around publishing as they're developing over time. And again, maybe this is something we can talk about a bit later on. And when I was thinking about sort of how could I summarize what the academics want, the word I kept on coming back to was partnership. A sense in which there's a collaborative, as has already been said, a collaborative relationship between the author and the publisher to produce the best possible piece of work that we can. And it's a we can. Because the other thing I was thinking about is how the division of labor within the publishing process, I think, is incredibly important, and I'm slightly worried that it's going in a direction which may not end up in the high-quality publications that we want. I'll get back to that in a minute. One of the things, I was asked the question, what informed my decisions of to go with the certain publishers that I did? Speed of publication was absolutely an issue. Again, I talked to colleagues. I'd heard horror stories of particular publishers taking a very, very long time to come back with decisions. This is not something that I either wanted or could afford to wait for, because I had to get something out. It's a part of the pressure of my experience at that point in my career as an early career academic. But one of the other things that I think was quite important to me was also the editors of the series that I was publishing. I wanted to publish in a series that was edited by academics that I trusted and respected, and who would give me good feedback through the process. And luckily, I did something in memory studies. It was a memory studies series, and that worked out very well for me. And it's quite interesting. I was talking to a colleague who is still sort of that early stage in the career, where he's pumping out articles like nothing on earth and scaring me at the moment. I have to start getting my game sorted. But he was saying also that he just feels this massive amount of pressure to almost, in some cases, go, well, I know the book will be better with these people, but I'm going to have to go with this because it's going to be quicker. And I think that's something that maybe we will need to have a conversation about. When it comes to things like marketing, I wasn't actually that bothered, I must admit. I think that was something to do with the fact that the publisher that I went with was quite big, and I knew that my book would get out on the lists very quickly. And in fact, actually, the marketing bit of the process was one of the most frustrating bits for me, because if we go back to the question of the division of labor, one of the things that I was asked repeatedly was stuff about search engine optimization, changing the title of my book so that it would pop up on Google more, that kind of thing. And some of the suggestions I got were a bit odd, right, to put it mildly. So quite a lot of the time I was sitting there looking at this going, but I'm not an expert in this. I'm just going to make a load of guesses, and then we'll see what happens, right? And I'm not quite sure that's the best use of either sort of our time as academics who are trained in a very particular way, and it's also maybe not the best for the outcome of the book itself in terms of where it's going to go and how it's going to be seen. So in that respect, for me, I would like to see this kind of strong division of labour in a partnership to produce the best piece of work, whereby there's a kind of I produce the best piece of research can, and you help me make that work as accessible, whether that's through open access or not, and as readable as possible as well. And I think I don't know whether you guys feel this, and it's something we can get into later, but it's almost the sense that, editing, copy editing, book production, those incredible important skills that take so many years to develop are, I think, at threat of being devalued, whether it's by the march of AI and the use of AI in publishing processes and things like that, but also just the recognition that these are skills that are developed by people over time that are applied to work and produce good stuff, and we should foster and support that as best we can. I really do worry that goes, because if that goes, and it all goes back on the academics, if we go back to the whole perfectionism madness bit, we're not going to do the job well. That's just a fact, right? Or we're going to pay for people to do the job well out of money, which should be going towards fundamental research, right? So I think that's something that needs to be sort of addressed head on. And I know I'm speaking to somebody who's not embedded within this economic ecosystem, so I know that you're under incredible pressure, but it's a conversation that needs to be had, I think. You know, and sort of just to sum up, and I'm saying these things not as just a sort of highlight, not because I think academics are lazy or that we're not, it's more because it's just stuff that we're not trained well to do. And when it comes to copy editing, and sort of getting advice on structure and getting advice on even wording, things like that, we really, really value the input of editors who can be sort of these people who can keep us on the straight and narrow when it comes to the production of our books. So maybe they're sort of generally my comments there. And so just to summarize, it is that kind of question of partnership, recognition of the professional input of people like copy editors, proofreaders, indexers, as a skill that needs to be valued, and how we can kind of foster that going forward as well within this very tricky world that we live in today with the march of technology and voracious corporations. But there we go. That's me.
Brilliant. Well, thank you, everyone. That's really fascinating. I'm going to offer a couple of reflections. I'm going to take an excuse to throw out an anecdote or two, and then sort of pose a question and back at us. But I think one of the things that's coming through to me, as I guess probably counting myself as an established career researcher, which is a lovely way to phrase it rather than old or senior, which I learned from Aileen earlier, so I'm very grateful to that, is I think there clearly has been a change over the years. Because when I started out, I didn't really know at all what I was doing, and actually looking back, I was quite lackadaisical. So I had a manuscript which sat on the desk of a series editor who didn't use email, and I would occasionally write to his secretary at the University of Essex, who would kind of come back and say, oh, actually, no, Professor X has not got around to this yet. It was going to go to a really trendy series with a high-profile, political-oriented trade press. By the time it got to an editorial meeting with that press, they told them that the series was cancelled. There's no way I would ever advise a younger colleague to do that now. It would be fatal, potentially career-ending. And I then took on, I spent a year writing a book proposal, again, for an academic series editor who told me that, there was someone who had been offered to write this book but hadn't actually got around to it, so could I, do this instead? I said, brilliant, really want to do that. After a year, he phoned up and said, actually, she does want to do it, so can you put that on the back burner? I would be really angry, I'm sorry. That book has never been written. And it's a high-profile series, and there's still a gap in that series where that book never appeared. So I knew nothing about what I was doing, so I kind of have two observations. One is, don't underestimate the ignorance that we're talking about really complicated trade-offs between the pressure to get work out there, that desire to reach an audience, which is fundamental, I think, to everything that everyone said, but then also the lack of knowledge about what's happening inside a press or a publisher. And it struck me when I was convener of the press committee, essentially head of quality control, that academics I was talking to didn't know the difference between the academic representative on the committee, the commissioning editor who works for the press, a series editor who might be at a different university. And it all seemed very abstract, and I could never get my head around it, but outside of a certain circle, I don't think people are doing the kind of research and homework that Zoe's describing, which, as you're saying, is coming from a values-driven aim to get your work out in a certain way and to ensure it's kind of like timeliness and impact. So the question I want to kind of reflect back at people is, I think things are changing. I was going to approach today by saying, actually, we've heard all these stories before. All the humanities, there's always trouble there. Or publish or perish, we've heard that over and over. But I think things really have changed. And I think that the university sector, particularly in the UK, is under greater pressure now than has ever been the case. So my litmus test for this is whether my dad knows what's going on, and if it's in the Financial Times, he does. And pretty much every day we're reading terms like crisis, death spiral, profound challenges, sector failure. Great. So I invite people either to reflect on those changes and how that's impacting on publishing decisions, or looking at the audience to say, what do you really need to know about the pressures on people now in the university and at different career stages? Because as we heard yesterday, there are 60 departments, openly where we know that they're looking for redundancies. There are other departments who are doing it behind the scenes and we'll never hear about it. And that is sucking an enormous amount of time and energy out of workers in the sector. So yeah, does anyone want to pick that up?
So I think that I'm feeling at a different career, definitely a different, the established career stage. I think I didn't feel the same pressure to rush as I think you two are describing. I mean, yes, I wanted a book published because I've been told I had to have a book published, but we didn't. Actually, I was outside the UK at this point in time, so I didn't have to worry about REF's precursor in any case. But I mean, I feel that generally I managed to get my REF publications out with articles, and then if the book comes out as well, that's nice, but it's not, it sort of takes the pressure off a little bit of trying to get a book out. And once you, in the British system, once you've got your permanent job, you're not then also going for the tenure thing. Yes, you can worry about your promotions, but there are actually only really two of those, depends on your university, but your senior lecturer and your professor. And then I'm now a professor. Okay, I can campaign for a pay rise, but do I need to publish anything? Do I just teach? How many more books do I need? So it actually does feel different from earlier in my career. But also, I now know so much more about publishing, because I was thinking about Chris's comments about partnership. When I first published, I just did not know enough about modern academic publishing to know what I should ask, or to know what the terms for different editors are, or to know what I might be able to change. You read the contract, you go, well, do I actually have any power to change any of those clauses? Or if I try to, will they just say, well, go away then? You really didn't know. Whereas now I think I have a better sense of what's going on. Perhaps also more confident in my writing style. I'm actually becoming less of an advocate. No, thinking the copy editing, the manuscript editing, the indexing thing, I do care about them, but I also think that actually, remember the science journals have all gone to camera-ready copy? We in humanities really ought to be able to do that, and if the sciences have managed it, we could. If that was the price for open access, I would actually. That's anathema to many of my historian colleagues, but I would consider that. But marketing and circulation have become so much more important to me now than they were, because I originally assumed it wasn't really my problem. The press had taken on my book, they decided how many copies to print, and since I know that number, I can guess how many are still sitting in a warehouse somewhere unless they've been shredded somewhere. So the changes to printing technologies and how you calculate your print run are amazing. But that was really the press's problem. I was looking for reviews. I hoped it would get mentioned, but sales were never going to make me any serious money in royalties. Whereas now, with the open access book, where I can see on the online dashboard every month how many more downloads we've got, and I can see where in the world they are, and I get so much more interested about what's going on. And then I start thinking, what else can I do to help with that? How can I try to make sure that more people are reading my book? It's quite a different experience, and I feel much more involved in that as well than I did with my earlier books. And whether that is just traditional to open access, or whether that's junior scholar to more senior scholar, or whether that's different presses, I mean, you can discuss, but it feels quite different now in a fun way.
Yeah, one of the things I've been thinking about, so I would say kind of mid-career, I guess, and I've got to that point where I've got some projects that I'd like to pursue, but I'm also trying to work out where the particular skill set that I have can be best used. And maybe one of the things that area studies-based scholars have to contend with is all of the primary source materials that we look at that are in the target language, so in my case are in Japanese, and the extent to which we want to bring those primary sources to a wider audience within our disciplines. So I work on the 1960s in Japan, and we talk about the global 60s and that kind of thing, but we don't really talk about the global 60s because nobody really reads the stuff that's been published in Japanese in Western academia. So one of the things that would be a very useful thing to me to contribute would be to go out and translate that stuff and get it published. But I think there's maybe unfounded, but there is some wariness about taking that route, both from the side of how will that affect my career within the university? Will translations be seen as contributing important sort of brownie points for my promotion, et cetera, but also to what extent and where, to what extent publishers be interested in taking on those kind of projects, and where would they go? So we are a bit lucky in Japanese studies. There's a very good series, School of Oriental and African Studies, that does dabble in translation, and there are a couple of journals that allow you to do that. But it's one of those kind of murky worlds that I think for people in area studies who want to make contributions to academia which don't sit within the traditional sort of a monograph or an edited collection or the journal article, but maybe would be the translation, the annotated translation, that kind of thing. Even now, I wouldn't really know the best way to go about that. So that might be also something that needs thinking about. But on the flip side of this, I don't know how many of you guys have been playing with ChatGPT or Claude or whatever. When it comes to translation, there's a big threat to it. So I wonder also whether or not the commercial pressures that come with the fact that you can get pretty decent translations done pretty quickly with these massive language models is also going to reduce the scope for academics to make their particular contribution in that area. So in terms of change, I can see some big changes ahead in my discipline, definitely, in terms of the sources we use and the way we interact with them. That's kind of the first thought, I suppose, with that. But yeah, something to think about.
I guess I was thinking about practice, or like what academic careers look like. There is certainly the pressure in terms of traditional markers around producing a monograph, like I said. But there's also sort of a move towards engagement, impact, these kind of things, right? We see across UK higher education, certainly. And when I look and kind of reflect on that in terms of the roles that I've adopted in my academic career, I suppose maybe it's worth saying, first of all, that I originally wanted to be a journalist, and I, did some interning at the leading newspapers before realizing I needed longer to arrive at the truth, which was a sad day. I thought I was quite impatient, and maybe that's another reason I wanted to publish my book as soon as possible, because really, I was like, get it done, the deadline. But what I'm saying is that there are roles that I've conducted in my academic career that aren't probably part of an academic job per se, around publishing and kind of like public-facing communication. So working as a book reviews editor for the Journal of American Studies was something I did during my graduate studies. I went on to deputy edit journal with the Open Library of Humanities. And this is all work that's like part of an academic career as I see it, but isn't necessarily the things that are going to help towards the pressures of promotion. People say, oh, it's nice that you do that, but there's no sort of marker of the quality or the depth of time that involves. So I don't know what can be done around that, but I suppose it speaks to my closeness to people working in publishing and my interest in that. So I don't know where it's going, but that's just a thought has come up. So
that's an interesting thought there about the amount of editorial work that paid academics do voluntarily, because when Chris was talking about wanting to work with series editors, who are those series editors? Why are they doing that? Why, Alex and I have both been on, publishing committees for our learned societies and those sorts of things. There's a lot of academic input to publishing processes that certainly the humanities we've taken for granted that there will be an editorial board or a publishing committee or whatever it is. But those things are being squeezed from our perspective, particularly as you get to the slightly more senior stages where you get asked to sit on too many committees and you have to decide, can I actually do that one and that one and that one? And I mean, it's a version of the one you'll be familiar with. Can you get people to referee articles, let alone book manuscripts? Everybody's so busy. The number of times I now say no to those, whereas in an earlier career stage I would say yes. So there's a whole set of other the academic pressures on academics don't just affect us as authors, but also at whole other stages of the publishing process, I think.
Yeah. I mean, I'm tempted to say that. So one of the phrases that came up from a couple of you was partnership and wanting to work with publishers as partners, and that helps explain to me some of the loyalties that I see. So coming in, running a school with very different disciplines and very different habits, even between French studies and German studies, there are different publishers who have a very specific list that everybody wants to publish in, and I've not heard of it, and I have to be very careful that when I'm looking at promotions applications or I'm looking at job applications, that I am not bringing a traditional hierarchy of prestige in my discipline to bear on people's decisions. And I think I like to think I do a good job of recognizing, that there's a variety of choices, and there's a greater variety, I think, of pathways that early career academics can take now. They might pursue more public-facing work. I've just appointed someone who's already done 2 books, terrifying. But the second one is a trade book, and when we interviewed her, she said, well, I want to continue working with a trade publisher because I found that the editorial input just helped me think better. It wasn't something that came after the research, it developed and changed the research. And I think that's a live option now that in the humanities in the way that it wasn't, because the way we understand research assessment has broadened and it allows for multiple pathways, and I think we're less scared of impact and dissemination and reaching an audience, which was what we all wanted to do in the beginning. Like Zoe, I started off interested in journalism and I wanted to write books that people read, and I've ended up a manager, but you can't, there's no counting for life's contingencies. But I think that's one of for me, that's the challenge that's come up throughout the conference about the contemporary publishing landscape, that there is so much more content than when I started my career, and there are so many more options, and there is, I'm confident, a greater variety of levels of academic and research integrity in those processes. And that when you add that to the really painful choices that Chris and Zoe are describing about the decisions you have to make and how rapidly you have to make them, and then the time-poor academic who's maybe spending hundreds of hours writing a paper to defend their discipline at their university, it's potentially a very toxic mix. And I think that's kind of coming through underneath what I'm convinced are the amazing ideals that you guys are articulating this weekend. So I'd love to hear, I'd love to sit and interview these people about their life and work. I haven't been given the opportunity to do that. You guys do, so please feel free. We'd love to answer your questions and dive into the author perspective a bit further. So yeah, we have a question right here at the front.
Thank you everyone for your time. I'm Rebecca Brennan, Princeton University Press. Something that we pay a lot of attention to and spend a lot of time thinking about as university presses is our very rigorous peer review process, and I was quite interested that the issue of speed particularly came up for both Chris and Zoe, thinking about your publishing and how that ties into maybe how you feel about the importance of peer review with the presses that you publish with.
Great question. I think peer review is so important and has been massively useful in everything I've published, and I've had some extensive things and some things that hurt to this day, but they've all made me a better researcher. So absolutely, when I'm talking about timeliness, I'm really talking about getting the ball rolling. I'm talking about those initial conversations, and maybe it was because it was coming in cold as a junior researcher. I didn't know who to speak to, and it was sort of, dear press, it was really, and I guess that also comes from a position of being the first person in my family to go to university, not knowing any professors, apart from that one who had supervised my PhD. So yeah, I really mean timeliness in that. In terms of peer review, I will back that till the end. Yeah, what is there without that? Yeah.
No, I agree, absolutely. It's exactly the same thing. But there's, you can find yourself in peer review processes. There are particular journals that are well known in Japanese studies that you can put in an article and you'll find out 3 years later. But people will still try and get in that journal because it's prestigious. Whereas they could have gone somewhere that was perfectly fine and they could have gone on with their life. So timeliness more than less. What's it? Less haste, more speed. That one. Yeah.
Can I just put a point on time while we're thinking about it? Because I have the opposite experience with time at the moment, is the problem with the advanced contract idea that we have with books as against journal articles, is that I have to say, I want to write this, and I'm going to promise it to you by this deadline. And I'm afraid at this, I keep being too busy. I'm clearly a very bad judge, at least at this phase of my career, about how long it will take me to research and write a book. And then you've got this contract deadline hanging over you. At least with an article, I can finish it when I'm ready to finish it. So I'm actually starting, I don't know whether there's discussions going on in the monograph publishing community about advanced contracts versus not, but the current thing I'm writing is not contracted, and I'm going to get quite a long way further through before I do contract it, because then I won't have that deadline hanging over me. But that means I'm missing out on the possibility of those developmental conversations, which I would kind of quite like. So I'm a bit stuck on that one at the moment. But that different, it's my fault, timeliness, that one.
I'm also overdue on a book, but I guess that relates as well to another thought about the book you can write. Maybe is the other thing I was thinking about when we were speaking. It was easy to write a sort of solid academic monograph coming out of graduate school because I'd done all the research and I had the time, and I guess my second book now is going to be a teaching handbook because I've been doing a lot of that, and I think that even finding the time to bring that together has been challenging. So that, and alongside an edited collection, that was easier to do as well. But I guess that there's these different career stages of the different things you can produce.
No, I mean, I think we're facing a real, it kind of goes back to Chris's point about the deprofessionalisation of the publishing process from the point of view of some agents in the system, and particularly policymakers, that helping someone write the book that they can write is the job of a trained person who is a professional, who understands the marketplace, the audience, what people want to read, but also understands people and is able to get the best out of you. And I was thinking about this in the connection to peer review, thinking about something that was said yesterday about the importance of personal relationships, particularly for returning authors. It's because peer review is still terrifying, whatever stage of your career is. So you have to trust that there's someone who wants to guide you through that and isn't just throwing you to the wolves and is going to come back and wave peer reviewer two's comments at you and say, no, you're out the door with this thing which has taken you two or 3 years. So I think it's absolutely critical to our experience, but I think more importantly, as we've said throughout the week, the days, to articulating what research integrity means and what the difference is that academic scholarship makes in the world, and all of the systems that support that, I think, just need to be better understood. So we need to articulate that value. We need to do that in the universities because we have colleagues who don't believe this, and then we need to articulate it to policymakers in particular. Thank you.
We've got a question on the app from Emma Brennan at Manchester University Press, who has said, how do you as authors feel about green open access and the availability of your own uncopy edited material in a repository? Does the speed to OA compensate for quality issues?
I'm not worried about it at journal level. I can't quite decide whether I should worry about it at book level, because I feel slightly uncomfortable about the idea of something that length. So I would much rather try to find a way for the full version of record to be open access, because I know how much the book changes between the moment of acceptance, and also for books, what is the moment of acceptance? Because if I got my contract on my, my proposal and my sample chapter, that's one version of acceptance. It's not the one we mean, really, is it? So yeah, I would like to find a solution, but I want to see a lot more work on the diamond space for monographs, because I think that trying to find a book per, BPC is difficult, but that's what I would prefer, is the version of record for me.
Yeah, I agree. I think that I've pursued gold or above kind of in my trajectory so far. But it's useful, green, I've used it in my own research. It's just not enough. More access.
And also not as discoverable, even with the unpaywall badge.
Yeah. I mean, I'm really interested in the non-discoverability of green open access. I say this repeatedly to anyone I talk to about open access. You cannot underestimate the degree to which academics, certainly in my field, do not know or understand what open access is, and they don't know the difference between the different models. And that's because the repository model meant they didn't have to care. There's another step in their workflow. They have to upload something, but no one's looking at it, and it's not achieved the ultimate goal we were told from research councils of making all of this work commercially available. It's just sitting there. It's created enormous bureaucracy, and it actually makes it harder to get people to think seriously in the ways that these people are about getting their work out there in open access forms. So it's been a really perverse offshoot of the field. I'm not worried because no one's looking.
Yeah.
I would be terrified for a monograph because I know exactly how much the level of, I mean, nothing gets added to my journal article once I've finished it, just because of where I publish. What's going up is the final version, basically. But I know exactly how much effort would come in from how many people for a book. And that gives me, I think I would stop writing a monograph if I knew it was going to be available green open access.
But for edited volumes and chapters in, I do use green because there isn't a decent model for them getting out there.
Yeah.
I mean, I just wanted to say, I am probably the odd one out on this panel because I am very ignorant of the different forms of open access, and I'm probably sort of evidence and testament to the fact that once we were given the opportunity to put stuff on into these online repositories and then forget about it, we went for it because then I could focus my attention on all the million other things that I had to do. And again, it's not because we're not interested in it. It's not. A lot of us would be very passionate about getting our work out in a high quality fashion to more and more people, but given the incredible amount of demand on our time spread across so many different types of work as well, because I think sort of the issue is not just the fact that we're writing and researching, but we're also teaching, but a lot of us are also administrators and managers. They're very different headspaces. So quite a lot of the time for me, I'm thinking, can I not have to think about this? Yes, off it goes, right? So in that case, it's maybe for I would say the majority of people who are writing and publishing in universities, is how do you create a space for them to positively engage with these processes and really think about them, which speaks to sort of broader questions about like how universities are sort of managed and how time is managed.
Yeah.
Hi, Tim Colbrook from Ubiquity Press. Kind of following on a bit from that, one of the things as sort of a publisher, whenever you come across authors who might not understand sort of the difference between OA models or when it comes to research integrity, the tendency is then to sort of try and be like, oh, okay, I need to create more documents or more guidelines, anything that I can kind of upstream this to try and give you that information. But then you wonder whether the flip side of that is that you are just contributing to this ocean of information that you as an author have to go through. I wonder just your personal experiences. Do you find, how useful do you find it for publishers to provide this information, or would you prefer more kind of like a centralized place that people could reference to and be like, if you need to find this information, this is where it is, but we're not going to make you go through all of this, all of these hoops to get to this point?
The second one. For me anyway. But it's, like I said, I'm sort of the Neanderthal here, so.
The personal conversation comes in as well, though, because you can have all the policy documents you want in the world, but maybe what you actually want is the conversation with the person who knows how it really works. Whether that is your contact at the press or whether it's your colleague who's been through the process with that press before. And sometimes that's more helpful than the actual policy documents.
As a policy nerd, I'd say yes, but like, that's just me. I think that having tools that translate that kind of thing, this morning I learned so much in the first plenary about the way in which I could look at different metrics for open access monographs that I just didn't know about. So I'm looking forward to going home and like getting into those. But maybe also things, I know there are tools around checking your eligibility for certain schemes, things like that. Just making things a little bit more easy at the user end, I think would be really important. Breaking things down into infographics. It sounds simple, but these things help public communication of that kind of policy get in. So more work, both, please.
I mean, as someone who has to manage a lot of change in a university context, I don't think it will help. We produce guidance every day on multiple things, and then we have to keep translating it for different disciplines to get them to use things which we've been requiring them to do for 10 years. But if it adds a change, I always say there's 120 good reasons not to make a change in a university. And I think that's a mistake. And I was very struck by Mandy's point earlier about embracing disruption, because I think the agency here shouldn't doesn't need to come from publishers, and it doesn't really need to come, we have scholarly communications managers, we have research directors, we have ref directorates, all of them bombarding us with messages about what we need to do with our publications. But it has to be owned by academics in the field. So there are advocacy networks, which I can see particularly amongst earlier career scholars, who are really driving the conversations around open access in the discipline. There are subfields around the digital humanities where really passionate advocates of a different university and a different way of thinking and working are really promoting open access as well. But if, and I'm thinking about the way Mandy's describing how Cambridge University Press are working with their journals, if learner societies and subject associations, if senior academics in the disciplines aren't moving that conversation on, it's not going to go anywhere, because one conversation with the wrong person who is looked up to, and I've heard anecdotally of this happening, someone's all teed up to publish open access through Knowledge Unlatched, say, so you've got exactly the same quality of output, it's going to be available to many more people, it's going to enhance your sales, and they've been told no because Professor so-and-so thinks that someone else might look sniffily at it if it's on your CV, or they find out that it's open access. So that's where the work needs to happen, and that's where that partnership between academics in their subject associations and you guys who also value all of the same things as us really needs to happen to kind of like change and drive behavior. Sorry, I didn't realize I was going to get quite so impassioned about that, but that was a... So we have 2 minutes, lunch is away, but I would love to take another question, so yeah.
Hello, Julia Hall from Princeton University Press. You talked a little bit about marketing. You said you would rather you would rely on the publisher's expertise. Yeah. You talked a little bit about having greater expectations now you're further on in your career. And I think also we've been talking very much about sort of academic books, monographs, less perhaps about trade books, and there are different expectations there. But and it's been really interesting hearing what you've been saying, but I was initially expecting, as I'm in marketing, expecting to hear more about what you want from marketing. And I wondered whether, are you all being modest, or, are you really, sitting, waiting for those reviews, wondering why the press hasn't done, more to get your work out there and to raise your profile. So if there was anything more you could say on that, I would be interested.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I could go on for much longer than the 2 minutes we've got on this. I mean, so one of the things for me about publishing the last book, Open Access, is seeing that we're close to 10,000 downloads now. It came out in 2022, whereas my best-selling book up till that point in time was 825 copies, and that was 15 years ago. So that number on its own is impressive. But I also know that one of the things about it being an open access book meant that when it was launched, there's a different process of being involved, because there's a link that I can share. And also, in this particular case, because I've been doing a lot of impact work around academic publishing and talking to people like you and other organisations for some years beforehand, I'd built up a Twitter following. Unfortunately, the book launched before Twitter imploded. So we actually had an amazing first month of downloads. And, it's tailed off something more normal after that. But it's a completely different experience from any traditionally published book, where you don't even notice publication day until the copy arrives in the post a couple of weeks later, and oh, my book's out. Oh, wonderful. That's nice. And then I felt no involvement in the other marketing, because it'll appear in the publisher's catalogue. It will be on the book exhibits in some certain big things, but I don't really have anything to do with that. Whereas with the OA digital book, then I can be involved. And because I am very consciously, in this case, trying to make sure it reaches out beyond just historians, I want it to reach out beyond. And I know I've got some of those networks. I feel I can actually contribute something to making that happen. I mean, I'm hoping to write a trade book next, because I think that what I've done with open access is get the academic work accessible by some definition, but it's in a different style. So perhaps I could try doing the more commercial, more trade route, but with a different style. And that will be a new experience for me, and we'll see how that one works. And I presume there'll be a whole different version of being involved there. But I couldn't have done what I did for the last book if I'd been a brand new first book scholar. I didn't have the networks. I didn't have the ability to do that. So it's different. And yes, I'm still waiting for the reviews. As far as I can tell, reviews in humanities come out ridiculously slowly, no matter whether it's traditional or OA, and it's a bit tedious. But at least I can see where the citations are. And they're in weird and wonderful places outside my field. So I think that's an OA advantage.
Certainly, I think I've only got the OA to speak on, but I think just having it accessible in that way has been marketing in and of itself, and the kind of invitations I've had to participate in different conversations as a result of it being available, I think, have been amazing. That doesn't speak to the kind of marketing in a sense of it being within other more standard processes. I have no complaints. A bit of a control freak about how my book looks, so that was fun, getting to have that control or at least a conversation around it. My worst nightmare would be like an abstract pattern on the cover of my book. Like that doesn't, I couldn't. I'm just an aesthetic person, which is not insignificant, I think, in terms of how you want to represent your research. And it's actually something we found in starting to think about the imagery for the Open Access Journal as well, that when we say to scholars you're going to produce a themed issue about about a certain topic, they actually do care quite a lot about the imagery that goes alongside that and what matters, and especially within, under the title of public, suddenly it becomes this thing that's being perceived beyond the circles of people who understand, maybe, like this, who understand. So I think that's been really interesting to see that there are academics who, when given the opportunity to have a conversation about imagery, are kind of interested. So that's my rambling answer about that.
Yeah, I'm maybe representative of the academics who write the book, get it out, do the next thing. And once it's gone, in a sense, for me. If it leads to things, then fantastic, but I just feel like I've made my contribution. I'm now moving on to my next project. And if it pops up on reading lists, obviously for promotion that's a pain, because it goes, you have to evidence the impact of your book in order to do X, Y, and Z, and evidencing will be those reviews, and it will be inclusion of the book on reading lists and all those other things that mean the book has to get out there. But there's I don't know, there's an element of also sort of, I'll stick my head in the sand. I don't know what other people think. I'm just going to move forward. In terms of the production and the design, I agree that it's something that we kind of get geekily excited about. And I wanted to have all of these wonderful pictures of students at Tokyo University throwing bricks at police. I couldn't, because I couldn't get any of the clearances. It was a real pain. So I now have not an abstract pattern, but an abstract picture of Tokyo on the front. That's not what I wanted, right? And the process I went through was I chose 5 or 6 photographs, and they were all no, because of all of the different sort of clearances that would be required with that, and I found that quite frustrating. So that it's actually quite funny thinking back on it, because of all the things, that was probably the most annoying, because the way I wanted people to see the thing I was writing about, as well as read about the thing I was writing about, and that was my way of doing it. So, but yeah, maybe slightly different perspective there for me. Just. Yeah.
Do you notice nobody said that what they want is money and royalties? And I'm just thinking about that, because my traditional published books, the only information I get about what happens afterwards is the royalty statement. But hey, $19 last year.
£2.67.
I have a paid job. I'm not in it for that.
No, I'm not. I don't care. I honestly don't care.
I don't care either, no. I would also like to just say thank you to everyone for making books happen, and that's amazing. Appreciate it.
Well, it's lunchtime. We could go on for hours. Please chat to these guys while they eat and stop them enjoying a healthy repast. And join me in thanking them.